Hey guys, it's Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing really well. And it's really awesome to join you from the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon today. We are actually going to do our first lesson that's a continuation of where we left off before our break. And we're going to actually dive a little bit more into the desegregation issue. A couple of objectives is today that you want to really pay attention to that we're going to go through probably in about the next 20 or so minutes is first of all, why Brown Part 2? Now, if you go to Canvas, and I hope that you're using that still, you'll notice a lot of documents that we're going to make some references to during this lesson, during this discussion, whatever you want to call it. And what I would encourage you all to do in our whole class sessions, where we have an opportunity to meet, and we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible and also as normal as possible, given our circumstances. And what I want you to think about is, first of all, this is a work in progress. So I'm going to be, using this and trying to adapt to it and so forth. So I would love your feedback on how you think things are going. Are there visuals, meaning, good lesson criteria, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just dive into where we left off. So we're going to look really quick today at a quick document that we associate with the civil rights movement. All right, and we already kind of did a little bit of discussion on this um, with our lessons before we tracked out. Okay, and I actually posted the picture of this. But guys, this is what I like to call the civil rights triangle concept. Now, the question is, whenever you get into federal government interaction with civil rights, the thing that we have to ask ourselves in this era, especially, is what are the three branches of the federal government actually doing to try to move the cause of, especially in this case, African American civil rights forward? Okay. And so if you take a look at where we left off, we talked about the judicial branch. What is the judicial branch? It's basically the branch of the federal government that we associate with the US Supreme Court. They interpret the law. Now, what did we say before break about Brown Part 1? This was in 1954, keep in mind. Brown Part 1 is basically going to be a unanimous court case that goes forward and says no more constitutional viewing of separate but equal. Okay. But as we said before, one of the biggest obstacles is going to be getting this implemented. Okay. And if you go back to where we left off right before break, we were talking about the fact that Thurgood Marshall, remember his picture in the bottom right here is actually, him as U.S. Supreme Court Justice. He actually went on, as I think a lot of you might know already, to become the first African American to hold a position on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a pretty important honor. At this point in time, he's a lawyer for the NAACP, which is an organization or a group that's trying to help advocate for overcoming some of these limitations to rights, et cetera. Okay. And so what does he do? Well, he basically gets the court to side with him, a unanimous decision, meaning 9-0. Nobody is going to basically be opposing, the other side or supporting the other side. But he gets a little bit rattled with the court when they make the expression in Brown Part 1 where they said that the implementation of desegregation should be, quote unquote, in all deliberate speed. Think about why he might be upset by that. And I think it makes a degree of sense why, which is why we're eventually going to have Brown Part 2. Okay. And so what does he basically do? Well, he goes out and he says, you know what, we have to give these states, especially southern states, a time frame. Okay. Or you could even call it a deadline. And so what does he basically do? So he goes out and he goes, it's a mistake that we're not doing that. I would argue that his point is well taken. The US Supreme Court a year later decides to have a Brown Part 2 case, which is actually, guys, in your module. I'm sorry, your actual Monday post. Okay. And if you take a look, this is pretty much, as you can see in the map here, guys, what segregation policy looked like prior to Brown. And take a look at what's going to happen 10 years later. There's not a whole lot of progress as far as overcoming desegregation. Okay. So I want you all to think, if you're President Eisenhower, who's in office when this happens, talking about Brown Part 1 and Brown Part 2, what is going to be some of the backlash? Well, some of the backlash for President Eisenhower is basically going to be, you've got a lot of people, particularly in the region of the South and the Southeast, especially, that are very angry. We'll look at what they had to say about that, responding to Brown here in a moment, okay, or both Brown cases, okay. And I want you to take a look really quick at basically what Eisenhower has to say. Now, this letter that, as you can see here, was written November 8th of 1954, is actually a response by Eisenhower to a brother. His brother was one of his bigger critics, believe it or not. Okay, wrote him a lot of things about, we looked at the quote about him, saying, hey, if we kill the New Deal, then basically our party, as a Republican Party, is going to come to an end. Well, in the case, he's kind of defending the court here, but there's a little bit more to it. So look what he says. You keep harping on what? The Constitution. I should like to point out that the meaning of the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says that it is. Okay. Now, if you think back to what we've talked about before, not all presidents have actually agreed on that. A good example of that, as a lot of you guys might remember, is, of course, Andrew Jackson with the Cherokee and eventually the Trail of Tears with the Native Americans. Okay. So anyway, but he's taking the high ground here and he's saying, okay, they made a decision. They made, obviously, a choice to support that. Consequently, no powers are exercised by the federal government except where such power is exercised, is approved by the what? Supreme Courts, the lawyers of the land. And then he goes on to basically talk about that. So why do we have a Brown Part 2? Well, this is about a year after Brown Part 1. Okay. And so if you all want to read the court brief, I put it there. It's one of the shorter court opinions, by the way, in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Actually, I had a student of mine in my class, Alex Kowaleski. Those of you that know him, you can congratulate him on this. Evidently, he researched it. He found that like the shortest court opinion was like 6 words long. Anyway, this one, as you can see, is a little bit longer. But what you notice, guys, just a real quick thing here, is that part of this brief, again, is trying to move things forward. But the big picture, if you take a look at all that it says, it mentions certain southern states, it mentions, it's a very vague document. It does not really give precise measures of implementing desegregation. Okay, so if you take a look at this court decision, which again is about a year after the first one, the question that I have for all of you to at least ponder and think about, and maybe even bring into our conversation as a whole class later in the week, is what would you all have considered a reasonable time frame to be able to give these states a realistic opportunity to get a plan in place and also implement it? All right. Remember what we've said before. If we fail to plan, we plan to fail. All right. So the idea of having a plan is important. So I'm going to leave that up to you all. I don't know, honestly, if, let's say you want to use Brown Part 1 as an example here. That one was in May 17th, 1954. I personally, in my view, guys, do not think that starting the school year in 1954, probably in August or early September for most states, is probably enough time to be able to give them enough opportunity, okay, to actually go out and have a plan in place. However, it's something for you all to think about. Obviously, by the next year, a strong argument could be made. The big picture of Brown Part 1, Part 2, at the bottom here, guys, look what it says. Overall, how would you summarize the purpose of Brown 2 if the Brown 1 declared school segregation is unconstitutional already? Basically, in a nutshell, what I would say, again, we can talk about it more if y'all want to, is that it's basically making it somewhat understood, but not, it is still kind of vague at the same time as saying goes. It is basically saying that we need to move forward, but it doesn't give specific ways to do it. Okay. Which, as you can imagine, is going to really frustrate people like Thurgood Marshall. Okay. Now, something to keep in mind is that Martin Luther King Jr. has not really come onto the scene as much as a leader of this movement, the way that we'll get to know him later this week. All right, so that's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay, so the question is, if you go back, guys, to your civil rights triangle, the Supreme Court has acted. They've already made a decision. Okay, this is unconstitutional. States are going to have to do something to support desegregating schools. The question is, where does the rest of this triangle come into play? Well, today we're going to look at the executive branch. Now, just a little bit of review, guys. Keep in mind, there's already been some precedent set here by President Harry S. Truman in regards to his executive order to integrate the military back in 1948. Okay, so he's already established. We didn't read a lot of that document. All right, but you can certainly look at it if you want to. But I want to spend the most time today looking at Eisenhower's response to one of the bigger issues that dealt with high school desegregation, and that's going to be the issue of the Little Rock Nine. Now, if you're not familiar with Little Rock Nine, Little Rock is a place, a lot of you guys probably know this, that is located in Arkansas, right, which is definitely a southern state. It's one of the states in the red there. You can see me pointing the direction arrow there. Okay. And so anyway, Arkansas, or excuse me, there, pardon me. All right. And so Arkansas right there is a southern state, and they are basically resisting segregation. Okay. And so what happens? Well, Eisenhower makes it clear. You are going to have to basically implement the conditions of Brown. Okay. And so what happens, you have a series of integration examples. Okay. And I'm going to talk more about Little Rock 9 today because I want to try to keep these videos fairly concise as much as possible. Okay. And so the Little Rock 9 is exactly the way it sounds. So there were 9 students. If you take a look at the picture right there, that is Elizabeth Eckford, the young lady that I actually have the little arrow on. As you can see kind of in the background, the woman who's a Caucasian woman, as you can see, not exactly on board with the idea of desegregating Little Rock High School. 9 students. Now, I want y'all to put yourself in Eisenhower's shoes. You're the United States president. The question is, what do you basically do? Well, in the case of Eisenhower, we already read a little bit. Eisenhower makes it extremely clear, at least I believe, we are going to support the decision of the court. Now, there's a case to be made that Eisenhower is more of a states' rights guy and felt like this should have been more of a state's decision. But again, I think he's a pretty humble, but also a pretty shall we say, moral man. And he says, nope, the court made a decision. Now we're going to basically support what they do. The question is, guys, when Orville Faubus, now if you're kind of wondering, what is that kind of weird name? It's actually the name of the governor of Arkansas. And maybe I shouldn't say weird because my name might come across weird to some people. Y'all probably have thought that this year at some point. But anyway, Orville Faubus is the governor of the great state of Arkansas. He is basically the chief executive at the state level. And he basically is putting up a wall. And he's saying, no, we are not going to actually integrate the school. So if you're Eisenhower, what do you do? What do you do? What can you do? Well, Eisenhower does something pretty significant. Okay, so first of all, he basically takes over, for the most part, the National Guard of Arkansas. And he kind of gives we're going to read a little bit of what he says in his speech to the actual American people here in a moment. Okay, but he basically goes out and he says to, the governor, probably in a private correspondence or whatever, but he goes, I'd rather you handle this on your own, but you know what? You're going to have to do what the federal government wants you to do here. Unfortunately, cooler heads do not prevail. All right, that's kind of a different way of saying that the governor does not agree with him. Eisenhower makes a decision. He goes, okay, I understand that you think this is a states' rights issue. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, but he's going to act as basically the leader of the nation, and he's also going to make it clear to the people what his position is. And he makes a famous speech called the Little Rock Nine address that he gives to the public. Now, for those of you that like to watch things instead of just see me read it in a second, I've actually posted a clip on YouTube where you can actually watch the entire address, and it has a little introduction to it. It's about a 13-minute video. It's not required, but it might be something that if you have a few minutes, you might want to watch it. Okay. But it's not required. Okay. And so the question is, guys, with Eisenhower, where does Eisenhower basically get more involved? Well, like I said a moment ago, he makes a famous speech to the American people. Okay. And so I want to show you this speech really quick, guys, because I think you're going to find a lot of it interesting. Okay. And so he starts off, as you can see there, September 24th, 1957. Now, this is, probably within about 3, maybe 4 weeks of the school year starting. Okay. And so we're not going to read the whole thing, but you can kind of look at, he's kind of setting the tone for a few minutes this evening. I want to speak to you about the serious situation that has arisen in Little Rock. And he basically is talking about this in greater detail. And then I want to bring to you your attention, guys, to especially page number 2. Okay. Section 2 of page 2. Okay. So he says in May of 1955. Now let's stop there and talk about the context. So this is the context of Brown Part 2. Brown Part 2 has just been decided upon the end of May. But look at what he says. He says the Little Rock School Board approved a moderate plan for the gradual desegregation of the public schools in that city. It provided that a start toward integration would be made at the present term in the high school, and that the plan would be in full operation by 1963. Okay. Now, keep in mind, we're talking when he makes this address in September of 1957. Okay. And so a lot of people are asking, is the president overgoing his boundaries? Okay. So what does he do? He says, well, if you're not gonna desegregate the school, those students, those 9 kids are going to be at that school. And what are we going to do? We're going to basically protect them with basically federal support, which in this case is going to be National Guard troops, etc. Look at what he says in part 3. Okay. So he's trying to justify why he's getting more involved and why he's doing what he's doing. Now let me make it very clear that federal troops are not being used to relieve local and state authorities of their primary duty to preserve the peace and order of the community. Okay. And he kind of makes that clear. But then what he says in the next paragraph, guys, brings it back to his role as the leader of the executive branch, or the president. Look what he says next. The proper use of the powers of the executive branch to enforce the orders of a federal court is limited to extraordinary and compelling circumstances. Manifestly, such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected right in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. And then he goes on to basically say, in the second part of part 4, the decision of the Supreme Court concerning school integration, of course, affects the South more seriously than it does other sections of the country. In that region, I have many warm friends, some of them in the city of Little Rock. I have deemed it a great personal privilege to spend in our Southland tours of duty while in the military service and enjoyable recreational periods since that time. A lot of people might be asking the question, why in the world would Eisenhower want to say something along the lines of that? And I think a lot of that, guys, is to an extent. Now, this is my personal interpretation, so you can take it for what it's worth. As I like to say, a dime and a cup of coffee with my opinion might get you something to Starbucks or whatever. But at the end of the day, the question is, why? Well, I'm going to kind of connect this a little bit to Lincoln during the Civil War. Okay. So the question with Lincoln, if you go back, he takes kind of a high ground amount, at least I would say. Okay. amount of support. Like, you'll notice like he's not saying, derogatory things really about the South. He makes it clear, you know what, we want them to follow our law, but we also see that they're a part of this nation too. Okay. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, as you can imagine, the backlash that you all saw with the map, 0% of schools in Mississippi were committed to the idea of desegregation. All right, we'll come back to that in a second. And a lot of people ask the question, well, what can the southern states do? Well, in their view, they can actually do quite a bit. Okay. And so what I want to do just really quick is show you a couple of examples from the Southern Manifesto. Okay. And we can go over this a little bit more in our whole class sessions. In fact, I hope that you all would want to ask questions about it, etc. Okay. But if you take a look, guys, pardon me while I'm strolling through this. Okay. I want you all to think about this question. Maybe this would be something we're talking about too. But I want you to think about the following question. Would you consider the situation that Eisenhower is basically dealing with the Little Rock Nine to be a crisis? Because if it is, now I don't want to tell you my opinion about it because that's not for me to do, right? But if it is, then the question is, how does the president respond? Now, let's take a look at this document. So a lot of you guys might be asking or maybe wondering, okay, well, how does the South respond to this? As far as like before all the stuff that leads up to him making a decision. And the answer is a good number of the people in the Congress and the Senate that are in the South obviously have something to say about it. Okay. And so just really quick, just to kind of get you thinking a little bit, guys, about this issue. Okay. I'm going to show you just a real quick little guide. Sorry. For the Southern Manifesto. Okay. So, for example, what arguments stand out about the response? To what extent should the issue be a federal issue? What we mean by that is it should be more of a state's issue that they deal with individually as states, or one that the federal government becomes more involved in. And then thirdly, given the Southern Manifesto was issued in March of 1956, which is 2 years after Brown won approximately, all right, does this support the notion that the U.S. Supreme Court should have had a timetable for integration? Again, a specific time reference. You must be desegregated by whenever. Okay. So this is what the South said in response. So take a look. I'm almost done, guys, I promise you, but I didn't want to just say, well, we desegregated and that's it. There's a little bit more to it than that. Okay. And so if you take a look at it, just a couple of people really did not get involved in supporting the Southern Manifesto. By the way, one of which was the president that comes after Kennedy, who is going to be Lyndon B. Johnson. Right? We'll talk more about him later this week and next week. I'm not going to read this entire thing to you. You can read it if you want to go over it. But look at the first thing. So the South, as you can see here, a good number of their congressmen and senators are going to basically sign this, that they support what it says. So look at what it says. It says, Declaration of Constitutional Principles, the unwarranted decision of the Supreme Court. Okay. In the public school case is now bearing the fruit always produced when men substitute naked power for established law. Clearly, they do not agree. Look at what they say next. The founding fathers gave us a constitutional of checks and balances because they realized the inescapable lesson of history, that no man or group of men can be safely entrusted with unlimited power. They framed this Constitution, the law of the land, as some people call it, with its provisions for change by amendment in order to secure the fundamentals of government against the dangers of temporary popular passion or the personal predilections, elections of public office holders. Now, some of you might be wondering, what in the world do they mean by amendment? One of the arguments there is that if you have a court case that you really don't support, that amending the Constitution is the way to really go about doing that. An example of that would be, I don't want to try to beat a dead horse here, but 1989, just a quick example, there was a case called Texas versus Johnson that dealt with flag burning. I think we talked about it a little bit earlier in the year, but not much. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that don't agree with it. But it is technically, according to the Supreme Court in 1989, a constitutional form of free speech. And believe it or not, there have been cases where people have supported an amendment to make it unconstitutional. As of now, it is still constitutional. That's kind of what they're getting at with this issue of school desegregation. And look at what it says next. The original Constitution does not mention education, which, by the way, is true. But amendment number 10, which is basically reserved powers, argues that the state should have powers that are reserved in them that are not granted to the federal government. Interesting point. Neither does the 14th Amendment. That's the one, guys, if you remember, they defined citizenship. They defined the idea of equal protection of the law, at least in principle. But the Supreme Court in Plessy has obviously seen that differently between then and, of course, the Brown case that happens later, the cases. Okay, look at what it says. Nor any other amendment. The debates preceding the submission of the 14th Amendment clearly show that there was no intent that it should affect the system of education maintained by the states. Okay. And then it goes on at the bottom here. If you take a look, the last part, part 4, the unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states, principally affected. And I think it's interesting they even go to far say in the next part, it is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of people, guys, that read that are like, yeah, 90 years patient. That's going to be something that divides a lot of these tactics, moving us beyond this time period, not just with schools, by the way, but with things like lunch counters and all these different things, trying to obviously advocate for more voting rights, okay, protecting other civil liberties as well, economic opportunity. King later on, guys, Martin Luther King Jr., as you all know, makes a point about wanting the government to pass what he calls an economic bill of rights. And by the way, that is not unique to King. I want to say that even our good friend, Franklin D. Roosevelt, years before, was actually in favor of doing that. So this is not a new thing. That's just, a new civil rights issue. With that being said, let's summarize what we just covered. So the question is, guys, with today's lesson, what are some of the obstacles that are basically facing the nation when it comes to the idea of desegregation? Well, think about what we've said. The first big thing is you're trying to overcome a lot of backlash from parts of the country, particularly the Southeast, that clearly does not support change. Okay, this map right there, take a good look. Mississippi, 0%. Alabama, 7.1, was that 1 thousandths? Okay. That map might be useful to you. Okay. How does the U.S. Supreme Court how the U.S. Supreme Court and the president as branches actually supported that? Now, we didn't say a whole lot about Kennedy and also LBJ with their executive orders. Okay, so we'll come back to this probably for a few minutes tomorrow. But if you take a look at this slide here, James Meredith with Ole Miss, which basically is the University of Mississippi, and George Wallace with basically University of Alabama, those are two things that happened entering the 1960s that, of course, deal with higher level education. Okay, so we're going to address those a little bit more tomorrow, and we focus a lot on tactics, principles, strategies, and measures to try to move forward as well as leadership. What you need to do now is take a few minutes to maybe review your notes from this lesson, anything else that you think might be helpful. And there's a little exit check for you. If you go to modules, it's the first one. You have to complete that one to be able to go on to the second one for tomorrow with the video. And I would like for you guys, if you have any questions or thoughts, bring those to our discussion later in the week. And I would love to have conversation with you all about things along the lines of, do you think that, the Little Rock Island was a crisis? Should have this been in more of a state issue as opposed to federal? What are your thoughts about the Southern response that we just read briefly? And I look forward to getting up with you again soon. Please email me with anything that I can do to help support you guys further. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.